Happy Easter, happy spring. This is just a time to celebrate newness. Last night on the news, one of the anchors on Channel 10, I think she said it perfectly. She said, "This is the time when we celebrate spring and hope." And I really liked that because truly we are celebrating newness, spring, and we are also celebrating the hope that comes from the crucifixion and resurrection story. Probably the two biggest holidays, Christian holidays, in the Christian faith are Christmas and Easter. And they both are about celebrations of birth. Christmas celebrates the birth into human form of the great Spirit of God, of that power for good, birthed into human form as the baby named Jesus. And then he lived his life as an example of what is possible when we commit to a spiritual journey and live from a place of high consciousness. And the beauty of it is that Jesus was flawed in some ways, but he overcame. That's the point, is that he overcame. I'm reminded of the story when he really had issues with the prevailing religious leaders of the time. And one time he got so angry, he went in and he trashed a place of worship because he was angry and frustrated. And you see, to me, I find that empowering, because what that tells me is that Jesus was a spiritual being having a human experience. And so again, I love what New Thought teaches, is that he is the great example, not the great exception. Greater things than I have done shall ye do. So Christmas is the celebration of Spirit coming into human form. Easter is the celebration of Spirit then returning, leaving human form to the next expression of life. Traditionally, Good Friday is celebrated as the day when Jesus was crucified on the cross. And then Easter is celebrated 2 days later because that's when it was discovered that his body was no longer in the tomb. What we know today as metaphysicians is that his passage, he didn't hang out for 2 days and then move on. When he left his body on the cross, his transformation was instantaneous. And as metaphysicians, today we can see that and we know that it's true, and it's almost a no-brainer. However, it's important to remember that the stories from the Bible are about things that were impactful for people in that day. And so some of the things that happened 2,000 years ago would probably unfold differently if they were happening today in the 21st century. And so it was important for the disciples to actually see and experience the fact that Jesus' body was gone. And so that's what they needed in order to really begin to grasp the idea that the body was just a finite thing, but then there was a greater spirit. And then after that, Jesus in spirit appeared to them. And so they had the experience of knowing that the physical form is not permanent and that there is an existence on the other side of this earth plane. And that was really a very shocking thing in those days to have those experiences. And so that really got their attention, and it was really important that it unfolded the way it did. So today what I want to talk about is I want to talk about Jesus' 7 last statements from the cross. Because for me, the death and resurrection are all part of one process. And the truth of the matter is that the crucifixion and resurrection are a metaphor and an example that we can use today as a blueprint. And it's not the only blueprint, but a blueprint that we can look to and be reminded of how we can move through times of profound transformation. Of letting go of the past and then giving birth to a new level of consciousness. In order to ascend to a new level of consciousness, letting go is essential. And so that's why the idea of Jesus letting go of his body on the cross was a very important symbol for those days. And not to be ignored is the fact that enduring crucifixion was a very difficult, painful process. And that he suffered as a human. In his human body, he experienced suffering. And ultimately, he released it and moved beyond. Now, as I have often said, that the credence to a story from the New Testament is when you see a similar story occur in all 4 Gospels. And all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, remembering that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were kind of the historical perspective, and then the book of John was more of a metaphysical and spiritual interpretation of what went on in Jesus' life. So the fact that these 7 statements occur in all 4 Gospels is very important and lends a lot of credence to the fact that these 4 people who wrote at different times, it's real important that they didn't all sit down at the same time and write the Gospels. They were written in different times in different places, but all 4 remembered those 7 statements. So I will tell you what they are, and then we'll take a look at them. The first one was, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The second was, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. The third is, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. The fourth is, my God, this is my destiny. Often mistranslated as, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And with the study of the Aramaic Bible, going all the way back to the original Aramaic. So I'm going to give you my one phrase of Aramaic. I get to brush it off, bring it out once a year. Eli, Eli, lamana sabachthani. And that means, and it's like the difference of like a syllable or an emphasis is the difference between saying, why hast thou forsaken me, or this is my destiny. Certainly one more powerful than the other. And I will come back to that. So the fourth statement, my God, this is my destiny. The fifth statement, I thirst. The sixth statement, it is finished. And the seventh statement, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So the first word, Father, forgive them, actually first sentence, for they know not what they do. I don't know about any of you, but forgiveness can be really tough. Even though I understand that for me, when I forgive someone or I forgive myself, and somehow the latter is more difficult for me more often than not, and I don't think I'm alone in that. But nevertheless, all I'm doing is I'm releasing the power it has. And so that sounds a little bit simplistic. And it sounds like, well, of course I want to let go of the hooks that this incident or whatever has in me. That it's got me hooked. Of course I want to let that go. And sometimes it is easier said than done. And what I love about this statement is that Jesus doesn't say, I forgive. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And here's what I think that means. I think that means that Jesus was acknowledging that sometimes forgiveness is difficult and that we get to call on our higher power, however we conceive that, to help us in the forgiveness process, to help us to release. And that to me is very comforting, because what that means is that if I have a circumstance or a situation with myself or someone else that I'm really struggling with being able to let go and forgive and to no longer allow it to have its hooks in my life, I can turn to my higher power. And I can affirm that while I may be having humanly a difficult time with letting this go, that the Great Spirit has no problem at all. And when I tap on that power, that then I am more readily able to forgive. And so Jesus used that as an example. It's not hard to imagine, having been going through the process of crucifixion, it's not hard to imagine that it might be a little challenging to forgive the people who did a lot of really, really horrible things. And so Jesus, as the great example, calls upon a higher power to forgive through him, to let it go. And again, that's the power of that, is that sometimes we may get stuck in the idea of forgiving, but God is never stuck. And when we align with that, when we accept that power, then we are more readily able to forgive. The second word, statement. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And this is a statement that Jesus made to the other two men that were on the cross with him. Now, paradise is another word for the kingdom of heaven. And so, what Jesus was saying is that today you will be with me in paradise. And I have to wonder if the past tense, how that really existed. Today you are with me in paradise, although hanging on a cross doesn't feel much like paradise, I don't think. And so perhaps it is the affirmation of a greater good that is unfolding, even though the present moment is painful and challenging and awful. There is a greater good unfolding. How many times have you experience, because I have, that sometimes when I'm faced with taking the next step along my spiritual journey, I experience fear that maybe I'm going to lose something, that I'm going to lose something that's of value to me, that in order to step forth spiritually, I'm going to have to leave behind something that's valuable to me. And that is just a fear. That is just a fear. Because there is nothing ever lost in the mind of God. And that the will of God is always for our good. And so, in a manner of speaking, Jesus was saying to the other two men, this too shall pass, and we will experience paradise, which is heaven on earth. And heaven, which we know are states of consciousness. And we also know, well, I'll say it a different way. I believe, and it is taught in the New Thought movement, that there is an existence after life. Ernest Holmes says that we evolve and it is forever and ever expanding. So what that says to me is that when I release this body, whatever form or not I have is going to be more expansive than what I have now. And so that greater expansion is also part of the kingdom of heaven. So in those words, Jesus is encouraging those two other men that a greater good is unfolding. Now, I think that if he would have used those exact words, I think that anybody might have a little difficulty when you're in the midst of difficulty and challenge and suffering. Sometimes it's hard to hear this too shall pass. Even if we know it. You know, as metaphysicians, most of us have a sense of whatever difficulty we're going through is going to pass. And sometimes, even though we believe it, it's difficult when you're in the midst of something really painful and difficult and challenging. And so, the other thing that statement does is that it brings Jesus and those two men into the present moment, into the now moment, where there is nothing wrong. And that's really hard, again, thinking about the experience of crucifixion, to say there's nothing wrong. But in truth, ultimately, nothing has gone wrong. And it's so hard when we have a very difficult, painful, challenging experience to not want to name it as bad or wrong. But we don't have to. And I think that's what Jesus is telling these two men. The third phrase is, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. Now those words were spoken to Jesus, to his mother Mary, and to his disciple John. So what's up with that? I believe that this statement resonates on two levels. The first level is a very human level of basically charging John with taking care of his mother. So he's telling his mother, I am charging this man who will be in the role of your son, and you will be taken care of. Which is the truth about life, is that divine love is always providing us what we need to continue on the path to our highest good. And the difficulty arises when we separate ourselves from that. but we can always remember. The second lesson is on a grander scale that basically says that we are all mothers, we are all daughters, we are all sons, and that we can let go of the traditional ideas of what that means on a human term and instead embrace all of humanity as our family. That we are mothers, we are fathers, we are daughters, we are sons. What if we saw everyone that we encountered as part of our family? And as part of our family, then my choices and what I do and what I say has an impact on my family. And so those are the two lessons that we are always provided for, and that it is very powerful when we step beyond our smallness and look at the universe and every person as members of our family. Now the fourth phrase is the one I spoke of earlier. My God, this is my destiny. And on its face, it's a little hard to imagine someone who is physically suffering at the level that Jesus was suffering on the cross on the human plane and saying, this is my destiny. What that means to me is that in that moment, Jesus is stating his acceptance of what is transpiring. He is no longer naming it good or bad or horrible or wrong, and that this is my path. Now, I wish it were true on a human level. If we could move through our lives without some of the really difficult, painful challenges that we all encounter. We don't get to do that. However, what we do get to do is we do get to decide how we are going to engage with that. Are we going to be victims or are we going to be victors? When we're a victim is poor me, this sucks, life isn't fair, and etc., etc., etc. A victor says, God is more than this. That's where I start. God is more than this. And then you can move to I am more than this. And now you can get to the place where you see whatever's happening as something that ultimately is supporting your expanded consciousness and your experience of good. And so in that moment, Jesus is acknowledging that nothing is wrong. This is my path, and I'm accepting it. He is releasing any part of him that appears to be struggling with what's going on. Now the sixth words, it is finished. Now some people say that at that word, Jesus was pronouncing his death, even though he says one more sentence after that. Here's how I interpret that. It's about being complete. So in the previous sentence, Jesus has said, this is my destiny, this is my path, I am no longer resisting it, I am allowing it. But in the next statement, he is now expressing that it is complete. That he is releasing suffering, that he has seen the full circle, and that he's done resisting, he's done challenging, he's done suffering. that the process of his journey of transformation is complete. Because when we come to the place where we transcend suffering, when we transcend, we move from being victims to victors, that is the completion of the process. There's another way to look at it, more contemporary vernacular. I know that sometimes when I'm working on something, or something's going on in my life that I'm really working hard at, and sometimes it feels like I'm on the hamster wheel. Sometimes it feels like I'm knocking my head up against a brick wall. Anybody have that? Thank you. One other person. Hey, feel you. I feel you, bro. Now, I know for me sometimes when I'm doing these things, finally, it's like, I don't want to do this anymore, and I say, I'm done. I am so done. And what that means when I say that is it's like I'm not struggling with this anymore. I'm not beating my head up against the wall. I am not resisting this anymore. I'm stepping away. I'm letting go. I'm done. And when I say that, on a human plane, sometimes that is the point. That is the point where I say, "Oh God, maybe you have a better idea. I've been beating my head up against the wall and nothing's been working. Maybe there's a different way to look at this." And sometimes we have to get to the place where we've tried everything we need, we know, and a lot of us people that are really self-reliant and independent, I think that it's more challenging for us sometimes to admit that we are of our own selves not able to solve something. And then to take the step back and say, okay, thy will be done. In the book of Revelation, oh boy, there's like a whole series that talks about that book. There's so much symbolism and so many different ways of interpreting. People have used that book for years trying to figure out when the second coming is and when the end of days is and all kinds of things. However, one of the central themes in the book of Revelation is the attempt to describe heaven and what it looks like. And it is just rife with metaphors, sea of glass, all of that sort of thing. But the one passage that speaks to me is the passage that says there will be no more sorrow, that I will wipe the tears from their eyes, there will be no more sadness. That sounds like heaven. So when we release our struggle and our resistance and our raging against the machine, as it were, then there is no more sorrow, there is no more sadness, there is no more frustration, because we then allow, finally, for some of us, the power for good in the universe is greater than we are. We actually say, oh, right, there is this power for good. And now I can tap into that. And now I'm allowing that. Too bad I had to go through all this other stuff to get there. However, I got there. I'm done. It is finished. And then the last phrase says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And what he's really talking about is surrender, and that's a hard concept. To absolutely let go and let God sounds easy, but how many times do you do a spiritual mind treatment or an affirmation, and then 5 minutes later do or say something that is the exact opposite. That's okay. I think most of us do it. And the point is that we can choose again. We can notice it and we can choose again. That we can let go and let God. And that place where we really do let go, that is the final and most important step of transformation, because then we are genuinely and fully allowing something different, something perhaps new to us, to come into our experience. Thy will be done. I think it was Joan Stedman, I'm not sure. But it's kind of a humorous quote that says, why is it that when we say thy will be done, we think it's going to be something awful? That kind of goes back to the idea of if we're going to go on our spiritual path, we're going to lose things that people and situations and things that we value because we have to give them up to get right with God. Here's what Ernest Holmes says about thy will be done. Thy will be done. The implication relative to the will of God in this prayer is not submission to the inevitability of evil or limitation. It is a knowledge that the will of God is always good. So that when we say, thy will be done, we are doing something that Emma Curtis Hopkins teaches. I'm taking a teleseminar about scientific Christian mental practice. And one of the first chapters is, my good is my God, and my God is my good. There is good for me, and I ought to have it. So what if we could all really believe that our spiritual path is an experience of expanded goodness? And so in Jesus' last 7 statements, we see a blueprint of releasing, accepting, allowing, the steps that have to happen in order for transformation to take place. We have to let go of something that is holding us down, that is restricting us or limiting us in some way, and then we have to open to something different. It's the clutter thing. We've got to let go of stuff to create the space for newness. So that is what the crucifixion and the resurrection are all about. It's about letting completely go of something that no longer serves us. Jesus' physical form, his spirit is so great that it had done all the work that it could do in this physical form. He let it go in order to allow himself to move into a more expanded expression of life. I don't know, I'm willing to sign up for that. To let go in order to have a greater experience of life. Can I get an amen to that? Amen. Can I get an amen to that? Amen. All right. So in lieu of our treatment, what I'd like to do is I would like to read an Easter prayer that was written by Ernest Holmes. And so I invite you to just close your eyes and turn within. Today, the horizon is clear. The voyage starts anew. We are reborn. The true resurrection is not only from this life into the next. It takes place daily and hourly as we shed the limited concepts of life and come into the vineyard to gather the fruit of Spirit, hanging rich from the vines of God. A person may be reborn, remade, and renewed in body and mind just through taking a little time to get acquainted with his or her better self. Just through coming to recognize the invisible and almost unknown guest who accompanies everyone through life, the spiritual presence within. We should resurrect ourselves to the joy and simplicity and spontaneity of life and leave the corpses of our dead yesterdays in the tomb of their own obscurity. We should live more abundantly in God this day. When we come out of the tomb of our ignorance and disbelief, how glorious shall be the dawn. And so it is.